Hello, my name is Matthew, and I just read The Adventure of Wisteria Lodge by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This is a part of my read along series and book club with Steve Donahue. We're reading murder mysteries in the month of March, and we're reading all of the Sherlock Holmes short stories. And again, Sherlock is back. And this story, the Adventure of Wisteria Lodge, has many new elements. It's told in a very different way. It feels more mature or considered over by Doyle and by extension Watson. It begins with a preface of the last bow. So Sherlock has retired. He spends his time in some little village in the countryside in England, spending his days considering philosophy and working on agriculture. And so these stories now, and Watson explains, is a set piece, a collection of short stories, cases, leading up to a final case, which is going to be the last bow. And so something is more considered over than the earlier cases where Watson and Sherlock were actively involved and participating and having new cases. Now Sherlock has retired. Watson is no longer his sidekick, and he's very clearly now looking back at Sherlock's professional life, and then Watson, of course, also looking back on his own private life and the time that they had spent together. And it's interesting that this set of short stories, these cases, will be leading up to the last story in this particular sequence, the last bow. It'll be interesting to see how much of it feels like it was really planned from this story till the last one, which still isn't the last one. And the Adventure of Wisteria Lodge has many features that I think are very interesting. One is it's a two-part short story, a two-part case. It's even mentioned at the end of the case, Sherlock talking about how he abuses his readers with writing these cases, that this is one that would have to be a two-parter. And so the first part is the singular experience of Mr. John Scott Eccles, and then the second part is the Tiger of San Pedro, which is interesting. We have two cases that the idea is that they're building on top of one another, and you need to explain both parts in order to have it come to a satisfying conclusion. I don't think that's necessarily true. The first part, I feel, is significantly stronger as far as a mystery and an interesting case. The second part, which is going to be the explanation, felt a little flat to me. We'll get to that. But the second part has another interesting feature, which is the dynamic between Sherlock and Watson solving the case in conjunction with with another inspector. We've had Inspector Lestrade, who Sherlock is always fairly hostile towards, imbecilic. Sherlock was pretty much always solving the cases and then handing it to Lestrade on a silver platter. Then we had another inspector who recurred a few times. That was Stanley Hopkins, Inspector Stanley Hopkins, who was a young, budding detective very much trying to model himself or model his methods from watching Sherlock and reading the cases and trying to understand how Sherlock operates to some minor success. But he was still young and growing, and Sherlock was still solving the cases. Here we have, his name was Boehner, I believe. Now I can't remember his name. Another inspector who has also been is more competent, more experienced, has also been following Sherlock's example and understanding his methods, and it's really interesting. Sherlock is famous. He has his reputation. Everyone knows him, and we're getting this idea that there's a generation of detectives coming up behind him that presumably are the better for it. And so this inspector, Boehner, I think his name is, he solves the case. Not to say that Sherlock didn't. They both solve it following their own methods and almost make a game of it. Boehner says, you have your fame and reputation already, Sherlock. I still have my own name to make. So let's follow our own trails and see where they lead. Sherlock says, if you need any assistance, it's available to you upon just asking. Now, the beginning of the case, so part one, the singular experience of Mr. John Scott Eccles, has one of my favorite Sherlock short story moments. Again, of course, we have a man bursting into the door while Sherlock and Watson are in the apartment. He has a story to tell. All disheveled, unkempt. Sherlock refers to his attire as his toilet. So buttons are misstrewn, and his hair is uncombed, and he's all just in an order of disarray. And he says he had the strangest episode happen to him. He doesn't think anything criminal necessarily has happened. It doesn't really involve the police, but it's so strange that he's just coming to Sherlock to see can he solve it. And before the rest of the events start unfolding, there's a murder. The two police inspectors show up right at the heels of this John Scott Eccles, asking for a statement because there had been a murder where his name was on a letter from the murdered man in his pocket. The case itself is so slight and so strange, and it's hard to believe that Sherlock would have actually taken the case if it was just the singular experience that happened to John Eccles. And John Eccles is a very dignified, very British person. So he's stately and boring and commands an air that is just believable. He has that kind of uptight, upright British reputation, typically all buttoned up. And he just tells a story about how he has a public life, and he has lots of people that he meets and lots of friends, and he gets hooked up with a Spaniard, this Spanish man named Mr. Garcia, who very quickly they form a fast friendship. So Eccles is sort of a middle-aged, maybe a little older kind of guy. Mr. Garcia is a young Spanish, quick-witted, lively young man, and they form an unlikely friendship that happens quickly, completely on the insistence of Garcia. But we get the idea that Mr. Garcia and Mr. Eccles were getting along, and Mr. Garcia invites him to his manor house that he is renting, and that's Wisteria Lodge. And it's like feels like a whole day's journey. It's a whole event to get to this place. It's not just in London, but he agrees, goes to this house. Mr. Garcia meets him at the door, and it's uncomfortable. Almost as soon as Mr. Eccles arrives, he's thinking about, how do I get out of this? I don't want to stay here and stay overnight. There's other people in the house. They're all Spanish. There's the Spanish maid and the Spanish servant and someone else that's the cook. And they sit down. The conversation's not lively or entertaining. It's actually very tense and kind of distressing. Mentions that the food isn't very good. Mr. Garcia gets a telegram brought to him. He reads it, becomes even more distressed, and even drops the pretense of having an evening of conversation and just sits in the drawing room, chain smoking cigarettes. And finally, it's time to go to bed. And Mr. Eccles is now just happy to go to sleep and have this strange, uncomfortable, rather tense evening be over with. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Garcia pops his head into Mr. Eccles' bedroom, kind of startles him awake and says, "Oh, I thought you had called me. I'm sorry for the late hour. It's 1 o'clock in the morning." Goes to sleep. Mr. Eccles wakes up the next morning, starts off annoyed because it's 9 o'clock. He had asked the house servant or the maid to be sure to wake him at 8 o'clock. So it's he's woken up and he's awakened an hour past the time that he wanted to be awake. Goes downstairs or starts going through the house and finds that it's completely abandoned. Mr. Garcia's not in the house. All the servants, the maid, the cook, they're all gone. Goes into Mr. Garcia's bedroom. The bed hadn't been touched, hadn't been slept in, and so that's the mystery that brought him to Sherlock's doorstep. We find that with the introduction of the police inspectors that follow him in to the apartment, that Mr. Garcia had been murdered overnight. But Mr. Eccles didn't know that. He just went to someone's house for a dinner party to spend the night, wakes up the next day, and it's a completely empty house. Sherlock, and this is my favorite moment. Sherlock says, "So after you realized that the house was empty, what did you do?" And Mr. Eccles says, "I was furious. I don't know if they were playing an absurd prank on me." He's so angry and affronted by this totally absurd experience that he had just gone through. And I love the fact that he's furious for, as it's called, the singular experience of Mr. John Eccles. What kind of reaction would a person have if they go through this? And anger, I think, is just the perfect reaction. It's so human. It's exactly what someone would go through. They would be annoyed and frustrated, angry and furious. So that's essentially part one of the singular experience of John Eccles. Part two, it's called The Tiger of San Pedro. And it's a whole other case. It's essentially another short story where we learn what happened to Mr. Garcia. Sherlock and Watson are now in this area in the town investigating. The other inspectors are there, And it's all just extra information. The way that it's solved is for the murder, and also how the house became abandoned. Um, we just read a whole new series of events. There's a neighboring house where the Tiger of San Pedro, um, going by an alias Henderson, is living. We find out that he's essentially this crime lord, this dictator, terrorizing some area in Central America. Had gone to escape to England and lay low to live out the rest of his life. There's angry Central Americans that want to get after him. They've found where he's lived. There was this murder plot. There's a woman in the house who's been forced to live there, and this Mr. Garcia was going to be sent on an assignment to assassinate his name, the name that he has, the Tiger of San Pedro, and it goes wrong. If it had gone according to plan, Mr. John Eccles had been brought to the house as an alibi. He's awakened in the middle of the night and told the wrong hour. So it's actually midnight, but he awakens him and says, "Oh, I'm sorry, it's 1 o'clock in the morning." And this was supposed to give him an alibi. We would go assassinate the Tiger of San Pedro, come back to the house. Everything would have been in order. If the police had arrived, we now have this stately, dignified British man who just carries the air of respectability as this firm, fast alibi that Mr. Garcia couldn't have done it. That didn't happen. Now, the story does have, it dates itself in the amount of casual racism throughout the story. There's a character referred to as a mulatto, and his horrible, ugly features, and his horrible, ugly complexion. There's also this recurring theme through a lot of the Sherlock stories of foreigners stirring up trouble or being the villain. We've had the women from America, we've had a lot of Australians. In this one, we have someone from Central America. It very much reminds me of the Andy Griffith show, where there's so many episodes where everyone's just perfectly delightful, everyone treats each other in a kind and generous way. Everyone understands their civic duties. In this goofy town where you have all the goofy characters and all the eccentric behavior is rather lighthearted and harmless. But throughout the Andy Griffith show, there's constantly these out-of-towners who cause all sorts of trouble, and foreigners, but strange foreigners. So it'll be an Irishman or an Englishman. There's like the English butler, but there's people that come down from New York, and con artists, and pickpockets from Mount Pilot, and it's something that I noticed. It's always these foreigners coming in, stirring up all this trouble. And there's also casual sexism, and a lot of this is coming from the characters' mouths. But one of the inspectors says during this, there's the abandoned house and this murder mystery, and he says, well, and there's a woman at the bottom of the case. There's typical. Of course, there's going to be a woman stirring up all this trouble. It's rather unfortunate that not a lot of it's not necessary to have the story roll out. And it doesn't seem like the best explanation and conclusion. It's not the cleverest. It's not clever at all as to how the house became abandoned. And although it would seem a little disappointing that Sherlock doesn't have his Sherlockian moment where he's the most brilliant man in the room, reading all of these stories and thinking about how Sherlock has been building his reputation and becoming famous and sought after, the idea that there's inspectors that are modeling themselves after his um, methods and behavior. The idea that we have this inspector that uh, solves the case, um, and even has those like red herrings. He arrests the horrible mulatto. Sherlock is all upset about this and goes to see him and says, um, I just want to warn you, I think you're going down the wrong line. Uh, and the inspector at that point was actually outsmarting Sherlock. He didn't realize what he was doing. Now, what he was doing, um, he knew that this Tiger of San Pedro was actually the culprit, or the person that caused all of this stuff to happen. And there's a woman in the house that they need to get to. Um, and since there had just been this murder, he's lying low, and there's no stirring or trouble in the house. Um, and so the inspector falsely arrests this mulatto, as referred to in the story. Um, just falsely arrests him so the other person will, the Tiger of San Pedro, will feel like everything's all clear and they can make their getaway because they know other people are going to come to try to kill him because they know where he lives. Um, and so the inspector's explaining this to Sherlock, like, "Oh yeah, I just arrested him, made an announcement. It's in the paper. Here's this guy arrested for murder. Of course, I knew that he really didn't do it. I was just using him as a trick. It was a ploy to get the other person to come out. And presumably we'll just let him go, and he won't mind. He'll just go back about his day." And Sherlock kind of pats him on the back and says, "Oh, okay. I mean, look at you doing a great job. Just falsely arresting people." And the moment where you realize, like, oh, he really wasn't after that person, it's only clever for the briefest moment before you kind of take a step back and go, well, Sherlock does some questionable things, but he's a consulting detective. He's not wearing a badge, um, and playing things like so fast and loose when you are an inspector just seems horribly damaging. Um, Although I really do like the idea of this new relationship and the multiple relationships we've had with these different inspectors, Lestrade and Stanley Hopkins, and now this guy. Um, and uh, this story did have just one of my favorite moments when the guy realizes that he's in this abandoned household, thinks that maybe it was an absurd prank, and Sherlock asks, what was his reaction? He goes, "I was furious." I love that. So, two-part short story, The Adventure of Wisteria Lodge by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Let me know if you've read it. Thank you for watching. Please leave a comment if you would like, and take care.